Okay, everyone, so we'll make a start there. Thanks everyone for coming in the room, and for those that are joining on Teams as well. Hopefully you can hear us and you can see the screen as well. If not, just let me know via a message on Teams. So today we've got Dr. Leslie Mabon, who is from the Open University. For those who don't know, Leslie previously worked at Highlands and Islands, I think it was before, and Robert Gordon and Edinburgh as well as a postdoc. And he states that his big question in research is whose knowledge counts and why within environmental management and policy. But within that kind of a wide interdisciplinary range of things that Leslie's been involved with and we've connected with in the past. But today he's going to speak on urban greening for heat resilient neighbourhoods. Over to you, Leslie.
Great. Thanks very much, Troy, for the introduction. I'll stand here. The microphone is here. Anybody online, I assume there's a chat function. If you can't hear me, if I'm moving about too much, just tell me to stop and I will do so. So yeah, I'm Leslie Mabon from the Open University, although I live in Oban on the west coast of Scotland, a nice 2.5-hour drive up the road from here. And I'm going to talk a bit today about some work that we've been doing for the last couple of years on particularly how different kinds of nature in cities can reduce the risk that people face from extreme hot weather, and some of the challenges around that and around engaging communities in that work. So as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about urban greening for heat resilient neighbourhoods. So I guess the problem as such, or one of the big questions that's been driving this work is every summer the same kind of thing happens. Certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, every summer. It gets really hot, and that's not good. And you get all kinds of editorials and opinion pieces and things in Nature and the New Scientist and newspapers, long reads in the New York Times and things like this about how street trees are good and how we should be planting more street trees to cool the environment. And that's absolutely right. That's absolutely true. But if we look historically, there's a whole raft of experience going back decades that tells us that the benefits, the contributions to people that come from different kinds of nature in cities aren't always distributed evenly. And for example, in the US, there's some empirical research that's been done that says even now today, neighbourhoods that were historically redlined, black neighbourhoods that were denied mortgages and insurance in the past, have fewer trees, less green coverage, and have, as a result of that, higher temperatures and more fatalities in hot weather than wealthier white neighbourhoods. Also true, there's empirical evidence from South Africa as well that shows even still, the apartheid legacy is still visible in the lived and built environment. So there's nothing natural about how parks, trees, other kinds of nature end up being distributed, and how some of the benefits that we get from that, whether it's reducing hot weather, whether it's soaking up rainwater, whether it's just improving our physical and mental health, there's nothing natural about that. That's a social and political process, and who benefits and who loses out as a result of present and historical decisions. There's also sometimes as well a bit of a disconnect between how hot weather is actually experienced by people, where they go, what they do, and what local governments, national governments, and sometimes even researchers think people do. Also, we need to remember as well, what we plant now is got to be appropriate for the kind of climate that we're going to have in 30 years' time. So there is no point in planting a bunch of trees now thinking, oh yeah, these are great, these are going to provide lots of shading, lots of cooling, and finding out that that species isn't actually particularly good when the temperatures get higher. Again, I was reading a bit of work last year from Australia looking at, I can't remember the tree species, I'm a social scientist, I do apologise, but it was some species of tree that doesn't cope with high temperatures well, and surprise, surprise, all the trees that were planted for shading were dying. So, there's a lot to consider across time, across space, across society, which all feed into the extent to which the whole range of contributions that we might get from different kinds of nature and the environment around us are spread out. So the question that we've been really looking at through this work is how can you plan and manage a lot of green spaces in a way that actually enhances resilience to hot weather, in a way that actually engages and empowers neighbourhoods. Well, there's a lot of buzzwords and a lot of jargon in there on my way to that, so I thought I would take a step back first and talk a little bit about what I mean. So, when I talk about green space, what do I mean? Well, I mean parks, I mean trees, I mean gardens, I mean anything that kind of looks green and natural or semi-natural near to where you live. So this definition here in bold is one of our community researchers in Govan in Glasgow, and I'll come back to this later. And he came up with this fantastic definition of how you describe a green space, which is where you walk your dog. And so that was the working definition that we used for Govan in Glasgow. What is a green space? It's where you walk your dog. And yeah, that's a really nice way of encapsulating. I mean, clearly, I can see anybody who's maybe has more of an ecological background just thinking, what about wetlands? I think, yeah, absolutely. But this was a nice starting point for talking about what nature in a neighbourhood means. Also, again, I'm trying to kind of steer away from some of the language around nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, not because I don't think it's useful, but because particularly with some of the audiences we've been working with, it adds kind of extra dimensions to that we've been trying to just kind of sidestep. But, we acknowledge it's there and it is important. And we would understand that in terms of how you can work with nature to bring out a breadth of contributions to people. What do I mean by heat? So again, this sometimes requires a lot of explanation, especially in a Scottish context. We're not talking about warming up cold places, but we're talking about what you do when it gets really warm. And that means both, short bursts of extreme high temperatures, so what you might call heat waves, and also slower onset increases in average temperatures. What do I mean by that? That's more jargon, for which I apologise. I mean, it's just generally getting hotter. The kind of the boiling frog analogy, if you like. Every year it's getting a wee bit hotter. If in general the temperatures are a bit higher, that's going to have an effect too. So when we talk about heat, we're talking about both these things, the kind of short, intense heat waves, and also this kind of longer, more general way in which it is in general getting hotter. Resilience as well. So again, you could talk all day about this, but again, in a wide sense, we talk about that as being the ability of a society, of a group of people to withstand different shocks and stresses, like a period of hot weather, but also actually being able to kind of do things differently in response to that. So that was just to kind of give you a sense of where I come from with some of this. I do have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about this. I do think social scientists sometimes very unfairly get accused of jargon and get held to higher standards in other disciplines, but that's a separate discussion to have later over coffee. Anyway, so into today. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to give some insights into two of the focal cities that we've been working in, Taipei and Glasgow. I'm going to pull out a few sort of common shared experiences between cities. I then want to go into more depth on what we've found from the community research in Glasgow, purely and simply for a pragmatic reason that I've been a lot closer to that work, both geographically and in terms of my actual involvement in it. So there's more I can say about that. And I want to then reflect a bit on actually the process of doing research with and for communities. And we've learned a lot. And there's a lot of learning by doing has been going on in this project. And I thought it would be nice to reflect a bit on that as well. Before I do that, though, this is a fairly extensive bit of work. So we've had a 2-year project that's been funded by the British Academy. The Open University are also supporting us through the Open Societal Challenges programme. And it wasn't until I actually started writing this last night, I thought I should really have a slide that's acknowledged everybody that's been involved. And then I was like, yikes, there's actually quite a lot of people here. So I've been very fortunate to work with a great range of collaborators from the Open University, particularly Verena and Yitka from Public Health, also from bringing some expertise from Built Environment from University of West of England. Sniffer, the Scottish Climate Change Charity, have been working with us to really think about, well, what does this actually mean for, I guess, planning and governance at a local and national level? And as I'll come on to again later, we've had a whole cast of community researchers in 2 neighbourhoods in Glasgow who have been absolutely terrific and have told us an awful lot. And there's just some of them there on the right. So what have we been doing? So as I say, the focus for a lot of this work has been on two different cities, Glasgow in Scotland and Taipei in Taiwan. I won't lie, there was a certain element of pragmatism in picking these case studies because my collaborator, Wan Yu and I, we do a lot of work together. She lives in Taipei, I live near Glasgow. There was a certain element of pragmatism around why those were connected. I did also reflect a bit on the geopolitics of that, and I've written a wee paper about how somewhere like Scotland that's not really in the UN and somewhere like Taiwan that absolutely isn't in the UN can try and position themselves in international rhetoric on climate change. That's, again, a separate issue I'm happy to chat about later. But, there was a certain element of pragmatism. Also, the fact we've got two very different climatic zones. You've got somewhere like Taiwan, which is subtropical and extremely humid and actually very hot. And you've got somewhere like Glasgow that is more temperate and not really that hot, although getting hotter. And that poses challenges in a different way. Because, as you'll probably all be aware, we have in Scotland, shall we say, a rather relaxed attitude to hot weather. I think things are changing slowly. Things are definitely changing very slowly. But, there is still that taps off mentality. It gets over 25, you go to the park, you remove your shirt, you crack open the tenants, and you enjoy the sun. And I do think, though, the kind of put a C is not that. I do think that messaging is changing very subtly. There is a little bit more awareness at Scottish Government level, certainly in Glasgow at local government level, to say, actually, hang on, heat is actually quite dangerous to people, especially because our buildings aren't prepared for it, our infrastructure isn't prepared for it, and quite frankly, our people are not prepared for it. Taiwan is very different in that sense, in that you have a really good awareness there that extreme heat can be very harmful to people who work outdoors, to an aging population, and also to a population that has a lot of migrant workers who don't always live in the most privileged environments. So we've got two very different cities here with different ways in which, I guess, heat is kind of panning out. We were also quite cautious with this work not to deliberately target or aim for neighbourhoods that were deprived. Now, it did happen that we ended up working with neighbourhoods that scored quite lowly on the deprivation indices, but we took a quite cautious decision to avoid wanting to reach out to people because we have wanted to avoid giving the impression that we were reaching out to neighbourhoods because they were poor. And I think there's issues around research fatigue that will come back to the end of the talk. What we looked at and said was to say, can we find neighbourhoods that have high heat risk, that are where the average temperatures tend to be higher within a city, and also where you have different characteristics of green space. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So Govan in Glasgow, you've got lots of little parks, little trees, street trees. Pollock, you've got a lot of big, expansive open spaces, albeit these are not always of particularly good quality. There's a lot of empty grassland and kind of big parks with motorways running through them. So what we have in Glasgow certainly is two neighbourhoods that are both at high risk of heat, both at high risk under extreme temperatures, but have different sort of characteristics. Similarly, in Taipei, we worked in an area where you had, I guess, two neighbourhoods within this one bit, Shizidao, that had different types of green space. There was two steps to this. We ran some workshops where we asked people to draw maps and actually to draw pictures of trees as well, which was quite good fun, and of what they did when it was hot. And then in Glasgow, certainly, we've been working with community researchers to collate some of their fellow residents' experiences of a changing climate and of the nature around them. So again, just for a little bit of context, I'm just going to flash up a few images of each city just to give you a sense of the kind of environments that we're talking about here. So Taipei is very big and very dense. You might see there to the, I'm going to say top left, let's say northwest of that image. Let's use correct geographical terms. To the northwest of that image, there's a peninsula, a very narrow peninsula called Shizidao, which is within Taipei city. It is a less well-off area. It's also an area that tends to be sometimes hotter and also at a lot more flood risk than a lot of the rest of the city. also, a lot of it is very green. If you looked at it from a satellite map, you would see it looked very green. And some of that is wetland, some of that is protected nature land. Some of that is green, but it is wasteland. And something that's also worth pointing out about Shizadal, because it has implications, is technically everything here is what is known as illegal construction. So we had a big fight with a reviewer about this who told us this was a disparaging term and we shouldn't use it. But when we say illegal construction, what we mean is that there are things that have been built that were not allowed to be built under the kind of land use plans and zones. And this happens in Taiwan, it happens in Vietnam, it happens in a lot of contexts, as I'm sure many of you are aware. There are things that are built here that legally and officially were not supposed to be built here. The city government kind of acknowledges that. They still service these places. They provide water mains, electricity, schools, buses, other kinds of amenities. But when it's described as illegal construction, that's kind of what is meant by that. You have houses that are made of a whole range of different materials, because the one thing that this being outside of the kind of whatever the correct land use ordinance is, it means that residents can't always upgrade their homes. So you get a lot of homes that are either repaired or just built with corrugated iron and tin, which means they get exceedingly hot in summer. You have sort of patches of green space as well, and little temples and things that are scattered around. And so we ran our workshop in a temple in Taipei. Other thing as well, again, I apologise for the quality of the photos for Taipei, and there's a reason for that. It was so blooming hot, we couldn't go out during the day. You couldn't actually go out until the sun started to go down, which made it hard to get good photos, and it was hard to get anybody to come out. So this was one of the workshops we ran in the temple in the evening. Some of the maps that we had there, I'll come back in a second to a bit more of these. I want to share a bit of a slightly more familiar map first around Glasgow. So again, we picked two neighbourhoods where you have high exposure to heat, but also different characteristics of green space. Govan, right near the Clyde, and Pollock, which is a bit further out. Pollock, as I say, you tend to have a lot more open space. A lot of the houses are newer, sort of post-war construction, one or two stories, a few high-rise buildings. Actually, kind of remnants as well of ancient Caledonian forest, I think. Very small remnants of that. A lot of that land is privately owned but publicly accessible. Govan, meanwhile, you'll see in the background there the sort of red brick sandstone, tenements. And kind of this is one of the community gardens they have on a small space of land. Some of our participants in Govan mapping out what they did when it was hot and showing us around some of their smaller community gardens that they have. I'll come back and talk about these in more depth. This was just, I wanted to show this. This is somebody had painted this at one of the workshops we ran about how wonderful weeds are. I don't know if you can see it. It says "Mon the thistles, mon the jaggies." Not a Partick Thistle fan, just somebody who actually really liked thistles and weeds. I was quite surprised at. I did ask if what his football allegiance was, but he assured me the thistle was actually just a thistle and that it was no more than that. And this again, just a little bit. We did a little bit of feeding back as well. A few kind of community and neighbourhood events. As soon as we had initial findings, we came along with a poster and started chatting to people to kind of say, does this sound right? Does this match up to your experiences? Does this kind of sound right? What do you want us to do next? And that's all ongoing and iterative work. So as I said, before I get into more details on the community research aspects, I wanted to just tease out a few of the common themes from this first phase of the work, which were applicable across both cities. And something that surprised us a lot was actually just the sort of lived experience, if you like, of actually being outdoors or being in the heat. And what we'd learned, what we saw, what we heard, both cases was that even when it's hot, you'll get folk who will walk really far outdoors, sometimes out of choice, sometimes because they have no other way of escaping the heat. So in Shizadao and Taipei, we asked everybody what they did when it was hot. And then some of the residents said to us, well, we get a karaoke machine, we walk 2 kilometres and we set it up under a big bridge and sing. And that's what they did. They kept out the heat and they just sang away to their heart's content under the main bridge connecting the peninsula with another bit of the island, because it was shaded, it was cool, but it was it was a fair walk to get there. It was a fair distance to be walking. And we heard this in Pollock as well. Like, everything's really far apart. And when you don't necessarily have good buses, when you've got a backdrop of public services that are being cut, you end up having to walk really far to get to something like a shopping centre that might be air conditioned. So Silverburn, the big shopping centre in that part of Glasgow, that was somewhere people went to. And there's a fairly long walk to get there. And residents were very, very aware that the sort of level of shading that you would get would vary significantly between neighbourhoods, even between streets. We heard this really strongly in Pollock, that there are some streets that have got really good trees, really good tree cover, others where there's none, and they were actually unpleasant and people would actively avoid them in summer. Glasgow especially, the trees are great for bringing shade, but if you've got an ageing population, you've got to trade that off. Leaves are slippery in winter. Roots and things can make pavements uneven. That's got accessibility implications as well. So all these kind of things about, well, what does it actually mean to be outdoors and moving about when it's hot, and how effective really are some of the trees and natural elements we saw, was something that came across quite a lot. And as I say, how heat's experienced. So we kind of thought, it's going to be, everybody's going to want to know about trees and parks and are going to want to know about how they can cool their neighbourhoods. But again, what came across very early on in both cases was being outdoors or being in or near green spaces were not the only way that people in both cities experienced hot weather. So I already talked about the bridge in Shizzadal. Temples were another one as well. This was one, my collaborator, doing an interview with two guys in a temple. Temples are, for older residents especially, a really good place to go because you're shaded, you've got the wind blowing through, and there's also people around that you can chat to. And again, from a kind of point of view of connectivity and looking out for each other, that's really useful. If they've got hot weather, or older people are at risk, if you've got somebody that knows you're okay, or somebody that knows to go and look for you, that can be a big help. And of course, again, it does come in jest, but there is a serious point to it. In Pollock, we did another drop-in event. Asked a guy in his 60s where he went when it was hot. His answer: Wetherspoons. So, but then he said, there's air conditioning, there's a fan, there's iced drinks, it's shaded. And he says it's the only pub in the neighbourhood. It's supposed to be a dry neighbourhood, and apparently there's a Wetherspoons there. Which again, the guy made me think about something about a spin-off project around, again, the function that pubs serve, whether it's temples, whether it's pubs, anything that serves as a communal space or a space for interaction. These things matter. They're where people can check in with each other, where people can look out for each other, and that's important. Scotland especially, though, climate change and weather doesn't just mean heat. So wetter weather as well. We always, again, rain in Scotland. We get very, very flippant about rain because there's so much of it. But there is more. There's more frequent rain, more intense rain, more rainy days. I was hearing in Govan last week, Scotland, I think Glasgow, this year is forecast to have 36% more rainy days than last year. That's an increase. I mean, the health warning is I don't know where that stat comes from, but it doesn't see it. It sounds right. Intuitively, it's getting wetter. And again, people are noticing that. People are noticing that when they go out, when they take their dogs out for a walk, when they go and try and exercise, they're noticing it's wetter underfoot. That changes people's experience as well, and how willing they are to go and engage with parks and urban forests. And lastly, as well, just before I kind of drill down a bit into what we saw more specifically to Glasgow, in both cities, we saw a lot of this question about, well, who actually makes decisions about green spaces, who makes decisions about how you respond to hot weather versus how heat is actually experienced. And in both cities, we had participants who were saying, well, we don't think we can actually really influence the local government. In Taipei, that was because a lot of there was a perception that the local government wanted to sell the land off for developing stuff. In Glasgow, there was a sort of perception there was a bit of a disconnect between the city council and what people saw around them. Really good example of that being no mowing, no mow policies for lawns and parks. The council will say this is done in the interest of biodiversity conservation. What maybe more cynical residents will see is cost cutting. So again, without that kind of messaging around this is why we're doing this is what we're hoping to achieve, it becomes perceived as the council saving money by not cutting the grass. And that all that matters because actually being able to connect with spaces and having a sense of control over what happens in those, supports connectivity, it supports how people will engage, it supports the extent to which people's well-being, their health, as well as the contributions to reducing heat risk all derive from. And as I say, in Glasgow, there was also a real sense that species that are being planted, where they're being planted, how they're being planted, is not conducive to being responsive to changing and more extreme conditions. Things being planted that are dying, that are not being looked after, that are either wilting or being washed away in the changing weather. So as I say, that was just a bit of the kind of overarching stuff on what we found common to both cities. And now I'd like to explore a bit more about what we did specific to Glasgow. So, as I said, we've worked with 7 residents, 2 in Pollock and 5 in Govan, to do a sort of second phase of the research, which was around, well, what does hot weather mean to you? What is the role of the nature around you in reducing that risk, and how would you like these natural spaces to be sort of developed in future? So myself and my collaborator Verena Waits from the Open University, we in both neighbourhoods, we worked with community researchers to actually develop more specific research questions, to come up with kind of interview schedules and actually conduct some of the analysis of the interview transcripts. So in each neighbourhood, we work with an anchor organisation, and we're very grateful to the Village Storytelling Centre in Pollock and Impact Arts in Govan to actually kind of establish relations, help build some of the trust, and help us to recruit and engage with community researchers. And this is a process that we developed along a series of 1 and 2 hour sessions over a 6-month period with myself and Verena, feeding in some guidance, and the researchers going out and interviewing in between. So I thought what would be nice would be, again, some of the kind of initial themes, a lot of the kind of coding, the analysis, the collaborative stuff is still going on. I thought it would be nice to talk you through some of the things that we've been seeing so far, and also actually just pick out a few of the quotes that have come back from the interviews for us. I will put a big warning and an apology up. There is some quite colourful language in here. This is quite good. We quite like that. I think it probably does show actually that what the community researchers we've been working with, what they've been able to do is they've been able to actually get people to talk much more frankly and much more openly than I could. They've been able to get that rapport with other people in the neighbourhood, which we couldn't. And I think one thing to kind of say as well before I talk through some of these themes and some of these quotes is there's a lot here that isn't specifically about heat or about climate change, but it all sort of feeds into the picture of what is it that makes the neighbourhood and the people within it better able to cope when the hot weather comes. Some of that is around physical health and mental health. Some of that is around being connected to your neighbours. Some of that is actually about, where you go when it's hot. But what's come across very, very strongly across all this is the much bigger range of contributions to people that natural green spaces in the cities provide. It's this much bigger suite of benefits that generally contribute towards resilience to things like heat rather than specifically cooling and shading. So it all kind of feeds in, albeit in a roundabout way. And trying to kind of keep that thread and that narrative is something we've been really grappling with quite a lot. So the first bit was around accessibility and safety. And again, this matters in terms of, well, who feels they have a right to be able to go to a park to get exercise or to take a more shaded route if they're going somewhere. And safety is a big one, especially around lighting, especially for women, especially for older people. And Govan in particular, Elder Park, there's a big park there which does not have a lot of lights. And we've been hearing all kinds of different stories about this around whether the lighting had actually been reduced to protect moths. There was a story that lighting had been reduced to protect moths and bats. We don't know if that was true or not, but this was the story that came back to us. But nonetheless, what did come across was, there was a lot of concern about, would you go to a park when it was dark? I wouldn't. Could you have more lighting? Also, a lot about vandalism. I think what's worth pointing out, and I was saying this to Sandra at lunchtime, is that particularly in Govan, most of the residents were very cautious about blame. They did not want to blame young people for vandalism. And anytime we talked about vandalism, it was always couched in terms of, we understand that young people are facing a lot of stresses and a lot of pressures from austerity, from climate change, from the pandemic. We understand that life is very difficult and challenging, and we don't want to blame people. However, it is true that things are getting damaged, and it is a real problem. So there was this real kind of awareness there of not wanting to blame anybody, but also the recognition that vandalism was reducing people's kind of willingness to engage with spaces or to actually get anything out of them. And the quote I've put up there, picked out, was this story about trees that were planted at £600 each a tree. Each of them had got kicked down over the course of a weekend. And we heard this kind of stuff repeatedly about wood chippers being taken away and burnt, tools being taken away and sold, things being vandalised, things being damaged. And it came up an awful lot about something that actually, I guess, fostered a sense of almost, I don't want to say resentment, that's too strong a word, but fostered a real sense of concern about the extent to which residents were able to engage with the neighbourhood. From a well-being perspective, though, we also had a whole kind of pool of quotes and things. And this is where the language gets very colourful around healing and spirituality. So, again, this came across a lot in Govan, that the sense that nature and green spaces, it wasn't just about fitness, exercise, going out walking your dog, running, jogging. It was also the spirituality, the healing, the well-being. And this is the guy at the top left there. He says, he talks about Hippocrates, and he said he'd seen the hospital grounds, and you could see what Hippocrates was talking about hospitals and forests and gardens and how it should all work together. He also had a lot of the more pragmatic things about getting out, being good for your mental health, and also keeping weight off and responding to dietary pressures. And then this quote at the bottom left here is going to need some editorial work before we can publish it, but there's a really superb point in there, I think, about disconnection from the environment that you live in, and I guess the impact and the effect that being disconnected from your surroundings has on you. And and then this woman says there, set fire to the dirt bins. There's something no right disconnected there. And again, it's that kind of thing that, yes, vandalism is a problem. Yes, antisocial behaviour is a problem, but we also acknowledge that there are structural reasons why it is happening, and that these need to be tackled as well. So we got a lot of this as well about healing and spirituality, and again, that not just for heat, but whether it's flooding, whether it's rain, extreme rain, any kind of extreme events, having that connectivity to where you live and to the people in it is going to help cope with it, but also recognising that also requires addressing some of the bigger structural concerns. Again, I apologise for the language. The little quote in white on the grass, this has been included at the request of one of our community researchers. He found this extremely funny because we were doing the group analysis, and we went from the quotes about Hippocrates and the spirituality to then there's someone letting their dog piss and shit all over the pavements. But again, it shows you the breadth of ways in which this relationship to the environment in which the residents live manifests itself. And all this came down to the question of, well, who's actually responsible for planting trees? Who's responsible for taking actions against hot weather? Who's responsible for looking after these? And there was a real concern, again, across both neighbourhoods. And, if you take a step back, you think about things like David Cameron and the Big Society, it's very easy to sort of get into to see that there are a lot of critiques around making communities responsible for doing things themselves, because it can become a way of rolling the state back by stealth, reducing the state's responsibility to look after people, to provide health services and all the rest. But again, there was a fair degree of pragmatism that we saw in both neighbourhoods, which is, yeah, absolutely, this cannot become a means of austerity by stealth, but at the same time, it's also true that there are things we as a neighbourhood can do together to look after the places in which we live, and that has a lot of effect in engendering pride, and also, thinking, well, what can residents do? What does it need the council to do as well? So that question came across quite a lot around, well, who is responsible, not just for planting trees, but also for the stewardship. So you plant a tree, you make a park, who then looks after it for the next 20 to 30 years? The grant funding runs out. What happens next? And I should have included it a bit. We've got from Pollock, we got this fabulous Taggart style detective video. So our two community researchers there, Donna and Elaine, went out and they said, we wanted to just record the interviews, but there's something we actually wanted to show you. And so they went out with their phones and they made a film of this tree planting project that happened in a park, where there were ostensibly supposed to have been 300 trees and fences. The job had not been done properly. Half the trees hadn't been planted. The fences just cut out. And so we've got this wonderful video of Donna and Lee walking through, panning around, showing us the missing holes in the ground and where the fences stop. But again, the reason they said they wanted to include that when we chatted to them about it after was, we need that sustained support. There's no point in having somebody coming in externally and just plonking some trees down without consulting with the community about who's going to look after it, how we can involve them, where the trees need to go. If you just do that, you end up with that situation where things don't get planted properly, they don't get looked after, nobody really knows what they're for. And this bit, I think, is really, really important around inequality. As I say, I think there's often a big concern that we have about discussions about urban nature-based solutions, that somehow you're normalising the fact that climate change is happening and that we just have to deal with it as best we can. What we saw, again, especially in Govan, was a real awareness that that not everybody was at risk equally from the climate crisis, and also that a lot of the decisions about how these responses happened couldn't really be separated from much bigger questions of land ownership, income inequality, and the question of in whose interest the city gets developed. So Grieving Docks was a big green space, a big park right by the River Clyde. It was a dock a long time ago. It seems like a rite of passage for any famous man over the age of 60 in Glasgow to have worked in the docks in Govan at some point. Billy Connolly worked there, Sir Alex Ferguson worked there. You get the idea. But this Grieving Docks, this space, when COP26 happened, that was opened up to the public, and it was one of these little flagship projects. We heard this in Pollock as well. All over the city during COP26, you had these little flagship projects. Hey, Glasgow's great. We're doing lots of cool stuff. Come and see the cool stuff we're doing. COP26 finishes, the space gets fenced off, and it gets sold to a private developer. And there's a big debate going on now in that part of Glasgow about, well, what's actually going to be built there. This was supposed to be affordable housing. It's actually now slowly morphing into mid-market housing. And then when you get into ideas like green gentrification, you plant trees, you plant parks, you make things nice, you make things resilient to climate change, property prices and rents go up, and those who are least well off get forced out. There's a real concern that that's happening as well. Having said that, there was also a recognition that they are not Edinburgh. And I apologise to anybody who lives in Edinburgh. I think this is more about the new town. If you go to the new town or the West End, you have a lot of these private parks. And there is still this pride, actually. Yes, it's Glasgow. Yes, it's not perfect, but a lot of these open spaces are still public. And last thing as well was, again, just to kind of bring it a little bit closer to the heat, and to bring it a little bit closer to actually how heat is experienced. And like I said at the start, we tend to be quite humorous about hot weather in Scotland. But again, everybody that our community researchers spoke to realised it was getting hotter and that they were having to adapt their behaviours as a result. So in the bottom left there, somebody saying, actually, there was a couple of days it was so hot it was scary. It was actually quite scary. We were seeing the heat, we were seeing the burnt grass, and in Pollock, a dog walker. Again, I love the vernacular here, so I'll just read it out. During the summer, we've got the cool mats too. If it's pure roasting, then obviously we'll stay inside anyway. So, dog walking practices get adapted in relation to the temperature and the climate. that's true for extreme rain as well. When it's very wet, the dog walkers don't go out walking as much. So I'm aware I've talked quite at length, so I wanted to just spend a few minutes actually reflecting a bit on this process, because it has been extremely, personally, it's been very enjoyable. I've enjoyed working with our community researchers. We've also learned an awful lot from it as well, and I thought it would be good to just share a bit about what we've learned along the way. And one of the toughest things, I think, has actually been, how do you get the balance right between opening up your questions and closing them down? So, you get a grant, you put a proposal in, you've got objectives in your proposal, you've got things that you say you're going to do to the funder, you've got things that you say you're going to do, but also within that, you think, right, we actually want to leave it open and we want to leave a bit of scope to go to neighbourhoods, talk to people and actually focus in and refine these questions in line with what we think what the neighbourhood themselves would like to do. So that's, we kind of come in and try and be sort of open and say, look, we want you guys to tell us what you want to do and what you want to get out of it. The question we often then get back is, well, what do you guys hope to achieve? What are your aims? What are your objectives? What are the outcomes you're going to reach? And then there's that bizarre, surreal dialogue happens of, no, we want you to tell us. So that took a lot of kind of refining on the part of us at the Open University to say, look, we go in with some broad objectives and also some examples of, this is where you as a neighbourhood might be able to shape things for yourselves. This is what we hope to achieve, but here's where there's some flexibility for you within that. So that was very much a kind of ongoing and dialogic and iterative process. The other bit as well, after hours work. So we need to try and make things work at times that are suitable to and make sense to community researchers. I'm actually very fortunate, very privileged in that I can work evenings, weekends, I can do additional sessions. I don't have family or caring responsibilities, and that's a privilege to be able to zip off to Glasgow of an evening. On the left here, what you've got is you have got my Brompton folding bike, you've got a camping table, and this was of a Sunday afternoon. We wanted to get a little bit more data, so I jumped on the train from Mabon with my Brompton and a camping table, went down to the Village Storytelling Centre's Kite Festival, and we chatted to people for an afternoon. And we got some fabulous stuff out of that. But, that's a weekend, and, not everybody is going to be able to work at a weekend. So there's, again, a balance around how do you do some of that after hours work? How does that happen? How do you do that? Face-to-face working, we found, was also really important. A lot of things have gone online since COVID, and it's actually helped us with the project a lot. We can do a lot of things online. Both neighbourhoods, we actually found it's a lot easier to just meet people face-to-face. And that does not mean that people were not tech savvy. People knew how to use technology, but they actually quite liked meeting us face-to-face. They quite liked doing things face-to-face. So there's a lot to be said still for going places, meeting people, seeing stuff. And again, this is something as well that is, if any of you are writing grants, so I've got a very wise senior colleague at the Open University, Rick Holloman, and he'd said this, he'd done similar work in Milton Keynes, and he said, one thing he says I've learned is that you can't do this on the margins of people's time. And this means if you are an academic and you are leading a bit of work like this, you need a good chunk of time costed in to do it properly, which is not something that always goes well with fuel economic costs and things like that. But, there's a really serious point. If you want to do this properly and do it well, it does take a lot of time. And, that means good substantive chunks of time rather than an hour here or there. And so there's time commitments for researchers, anchor organisations, and also community researchers. And the last point as well was just a bit about leaving a legacy and trying to think how this has been something we've really kind of struggled with and have been trying to do the best we can. So project funding, just as it is for us, just as it is for tree planting, is often tied to specific timeframes, which means the importance of planning ahead, being flexible, and ensuring that you're able to deliver something that is meaningful to the community researchers and the neighbourhoods they're in the timeframe that we have. Managing expectations early on, but also having early discussions about kind of what the legacy is going to be. Being honest about when the funding runs out what you're going to do up until then, what you're going to try to do after, and where there might be opportunities for follow-on funds or for somebody else to maybe pick up the baton. So we've had these discussions in both of our neighbourhoods in Glasgow. And also thinking about how the project can support the researchers themselves and the neighbourhood. So what kind of evidence can you leave behind? What kind of skills can you leave behind? We've said for both Govan and Pollock that the sort of technical reports, if you like, that will come out of this work will be left in the communities, and they can then use them. If some of the community groups are wanting to go for bits of funding to say, here is evidence of a need for such and such money to do such and such activity, or here is evidence of concern about X, Y, and Z. So making that available for the I guess the neighbourhoods to do what they wish with, and but then finding an organisation that is a suitable custodian for that knowledge is something we're still kind of negotiating. So if you can find, if whether it's a community council or something, if there's some body that can be a suitable custodian for that knowledge, that's something we've again been learning as we're going through. Final point on this, why it's worth it. The people and institutions that neighbourhoods and the people that live within them look to when the climate's changing aren't always obvious. The people that get trusted, it's not always the council's climate change team. It's not always the local environmental organisation. It might be, as it was in Govan, the arts and crafts cafe. In Pollock, it was a drama and storytelling centre. Community researchers and anchor organisations, they can understand the terrain. They understand who's going to be listened to, who people look to, how you can connect. Understanding about how to phrase and set up technically complex or challenging questions in a way that people can engage with, but also isn't patronising. So this is where the whole thing about where you walk your dog come from. We had weeks of discussion in Govan about how do you define a green space. And that was the conclusion we came to, that you don't want to talk down to people, but you also want to have definitions that make sense and that aren't going to alienate different types of people. And also a rich understanding of what's been done before, how findings can feed forward, especially in neighbourhoods, Pollock especially, and Govan especially is like this, that are over-researched and over-consulted and over-engaged. So I'm just going to wrap up for one final minute, because I'm aware I've been talking for quite a bit of time, just to say, well, what does all this say about resilience to urban heat? And both Glasgow and Taipei, in different ways, are already experiencing the effects of heat. You can see that in some of the physical observations. You can see it in some of the anecdotal things we've been told. Different kinds of greening are one of the many adaptation strategies that they draw on to respond to this. Especially in Glasgow, urban nature supports resilience, like I was saying, in this much bigger sense of community connectivity, organisation and well-being, rather than just shading and cooling. But as I say, I think it's also important that this isn't about communities are fantastic and you can get them to do everything. This is not apolitical. Residents in both cities were very aware of a lot of the justice questions in terms of outcome and process around ownership of and access to land, in whose interests decisions were being taken, who was being included and who was being excluded, and how this ultimately affected how climate impacts and decisions about where green spaces got allocated, how all this happened. A lot of this was kind of baked in to what we were doing. So I'm going to stop there. There's a giant QR code that should take you to the project website, where we've got some kind of the basic information. A lot of the creative outputs that were coming from this, we're doing some collaging in Govan, we're doing stories and vignettes in Pollock. These are still being finalised, so they're not online yet, but they will be in the next few months. So what we've got at the moment is a bit, quite frankly, a bit dry. The Open University website is not the nicest. But as I say, some of the more creative and nice visual outputs they're already there in paper format. That was just a sneak preview of one of the bits of collaging that we've done from Govan. They will be coming, but if you want to see more, it will at some point appear on that website. So I will stop there at the moment, and I'm very happy to take any comments, questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. If anyone has any questions on Teams, feel free to put up your hand or put something in the chat, but I'll give privilege to those that came in the room today if anyone has any questions. Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering if you collect demographic information.
Yes, we did. Haven't analysed that in depth yet. We did collect that. I think one of the challenges is for one of the neighbourhoods in particular, we have quite a self-selecting sample. In Govan, we had a lot of discussion about how to kind of get beyond that self-selecting sample. We tended to have respondents that were a bit older, which kind of does, to an extent, reflects the demographic of the neighbourhood. We were trying to think about how you got to younger people. And one of the other issues that we weren't able to address for this bit of work, but that we would like to try and address in the future, is what neighbourhoods in Glasgow call New Scots, or people who've come from elsewhere and whose first language is not English. So there was a lot of interest in Pollock in working with people who speak Arabic. And we hoped to be able to train up a community researcher and to then get the transcripts translated. For various logistical reasons, that didn't happen. But all that's a very long and circuitous way of saying that, yes, we've collected demographic information. The sample is probably a bit older and is quite white, but that's something we're aware of and we'd like to work to address.
We've got a question here.
In your presentation, I pointed out that the main criteria that the local residents are addressing are the comfort, the transparency between ones who are proposing the projects on their side, and as well as their neighbors. What I also pointed out is that one of the main criteria why people don't go outside is their safety regarding the vandals, some unsafe zones, for example. In terms of this problem, how do you plan to deal with it? Because
Great. So in terms of what we plan to deal with those, I think there's different strategies for each, and it's about kind of getting the findings and results to the right people. There are things that the City Council can do things about around, I guess, lighting, especially, and also around how they do decision making better. And this is where we're working with Sniffer, who are an organisation that are involved with developing the kind of climate change adaptation plan for Glasgow City region. They're really useful because they know the people to kind of feed this into in Glasgow City Council. And we found it's often not deliberate on the part of the council that they aren't engaging. Sometimes it's that they want to, but they just don't have the resourcing or the time. So being able to feed that back is how some of the issues around transparency might be addressed. As regards things like safety, that's where the organisations, the kind of voluntary groups on the ground are really important. And we're quite fortunate in that both neighbourhoods, we've got people who are very prominent in the neighbourhood, who can link into those and can feed some of the evidence forward to say, here's a case for why you might, for instance, want to apply for funding to get more lights. So Govan, especially, one of the parks is really badly lit. Nobody will walk across it at night. We had a lengthy discussion about how you might then use some of the findings from Govan to go to the kind of voluntary group that looks after that park and say, right, here's evidence to say that nobody goes across here at night. Use this evidence to put a funding application in somewhere else. So those are really good questions. They're big questions. They're not ones that we can actually physically, technically solve ourselves, but it's about getting the evidence that we've created together to the right people to enable them to do it.
I'll come to you in a second, because there was one on Teams that I'd kind of hit on a similar issue. So a big challenge would be to find the views of the so-called vandals, and if any sort of engagement would have influenced how they treated the environment. Did your team have any thoughts on this?
As it happens, we did. And this came about completely by chance last week. We were doing the collaging workshop in one of the neighbourhoods, and 3 young gentlemen came in with a football to the library, asking if they could borrow a marker pen to write their name on the football. And one of the community researchers says, right, while you're here, write your graffiti tag down on this bit of paper. And then he says to me, he says, if I see you doing that, if I see that somewhere, I know it's you. And he turned to me after and he said, I'm kind of joking there. He says, but there's a serious point. He said, we know who these young people are. We've got a very good idea of who they are. Actually connecting with them is very difficult. He said, routes like schools, you can't get to them through schools. One possible route is things like sports clubs or youth workers. So, as I say, it's challenging. It's something that the community, the residents, and particularly the community researchers are very aware of. They intuitively know who the people are that are responsible for it, but actually kind of finding the right channel, the right platform to engage with these people is the really difficult bit. That doesn't really answer the question, I appreciate, but it provides a bit of a rambling context.
Sorry, I've got lots of questions, so I'll try and keep it to one. But the vandalism one's an interesting one, and I think there's often an assumption it's mindless.
Yeah.
And I think often it's not mindless, and it's not young people. There's often older people that don't want the trees there for whatever reason. Some of the housing stock in the photographs look like it would be quite vulnerable to heat itself. And I was just wondering if there was any recognition as part of the kind of the engagement with folk that green infrastructure could benefit the houses if you could take trees closer to the houses rather than just go into the green space, take the green space to the houses.
Absolutely. So a bit about each of those in terms of absolutely that point in vandalism and avoiding assumptions. I think that's true, especially the mindlessness. Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I think some of the points we heard, especially in Govan, about the pressures that people are facing and how that maybe manifests itself in vandalism, I think maybe speaks to that a bit. In terms of the housing stock, yes, absolutely as well. So Alice Muncaster, who's working with us at the University of West of England, Alice's background is in housing and built environment. We haven't done a lot of it specifically yet, but Alice is really keen to go through all the transcripts that we have and pick out the bits about housing, because she hit on that point as well. She looked at the housing stock and she homed in on exactly the same thing. There are kinds of housing there that might be prone to overheating, and ones where bits of green infrastructure could be very helpful to address that. So, Govan, most of the houses are tenements of the 100, 150-year-old variety, and most of the concerns that we hear there are about winter rather than summer. And even when we tried to kind of prompt a bit, it always came back to fuel poverty in winter rather than the heat in summer. Pollock has a much more varied housing stock. So you've got the sort of post-war kind of semi-detached. You've got what they call tenements, which are again the 1960s, 1950s, 60s, 3 or 4 story high things. You've got tower blocks, which absolutely are a lot more prone to overheating. Some of the residents talked about using their gardens and trying to get shade in their gardens, and trying some of the shading strategies they were using for curtains, closing curtains, for example, or trying to plant things. There was, I think, a willingness to learn more about how you might bring the nature closer to the houses. Pollock in particular, there was lots of bits of regeneration going on, which could provide an opportunity for doing that. So things getting knocked down and rebuilt, or houses being refurbished. One of our community researchers there, she works for a housing association. So she was, again, really kind of aware of that, about how you might then link to the most vulnerable people and the most at-risk people, and how you might kind of find the inroads to do that. So I think, yeah, definitely there was willingness to learn more about that, especially in Pollock, with the kind of housing stock that they have.
So we just hit 2 o'clock. So we'll draw everything to a close. Leslie is sticking around for today with us, so he's coming to our research group meeting at 2:30. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, you have a bit of time now while we head over there. If anyone wants to come to that, feel free to join us as well. That just leaves us to thank Leslie for his part.
Thank you all. Thanks.